Walk through almost any city park and you'll probably see them. Running across sidewalks, climbing trees, digging through grass, stealing food from birds. Squirrels are so common that most people barely notice them anymore. But here's a strange question: if squirrels are everywhere, and humans already eat animals like rabbit, chicken, duck, and deer, why don't we eat squirrels? After all, a squirrel is still a mammal. It has meat, it reproduces relatively quickly, and in some places, there are enormous populations living practically beside our homes. So why isn't squirrel meat sitting next to chicken at the supermarket? The answer begins with something that seems obvious but is actually incredibly important. Squirrels are small. A squirrel may look like a decent-sized animal when you're watching one run through a park, but most of that impression comes from its fur and tail. Once processed, the amount of usable meat is surprisingly limited. A single squirrel might provide only a small meal. To produce the same amount of meat you could get from one chicken, you would need several squirrels. And suddenly the economics become terrible. A farmer can raise one chicken and get a predictable amount of meat, but imagine trying to collect, process, and sell 5 or 10 wild squirrels just to equal one chicken. The labor alone would make the meat expensive. And that's only the beginning, because squirrels aren't livestock. They're wild animals. A chicken raised for food lives under controlled conditions. Its feed is known, its health can be monitored, and its environment can be managed. A wild squirrel has none of those guarantees. It might have spent its entire life eating nuts, seeds, fruits, insects, fungi, bird eggs, or food discarded by humans. It may have encountered parasites or pathogens. And because its history is unknown, every wild animal comes with more uncertainty than an animal raised specifically for food. But there's another fascinating problem. Squirrels are surprisingly active animals. They climb, jump, sprint, and constantly move through trees and across the ground. Their muscles are designed for a life of movement rather than for producing large quantities of tender meat. This doesn't make squirrel meat inedible. People have eaten squirrels for centuries. In parts of the United States and the United Kingdom, squirrel has historically appeared in traditional cooking. But something can be edible without becoming a major food source, and that distinction explains why squirrels remained a niche food. Now consider their relationship with humans. Squirrels live incredibly close to us. They've adapted to parks, gardens, suburbs, university campuses, and city neighborhoods. You can find them searching for food only a few meters away from people. That sounds like an enormous potential food supply, but it creates a completely different problem. You can't simply turn a city park into a meat farm. Wildlife laws restrict hunting in many urban areas. Even where hunting squirrels is legal, there are seasons, permits, bag limits, and rules about where hunting can take place. These restrictions exist because wildlife populations aren't managed like livestock. The goal isn't to maximize the number of squirrels humans can kill. The goal is to maintain a healthy population. And that brings us to an important misconception. Seeing squirrels everywhere doesn't necessarily mean there are unlimited squirrels. Urban squirrels are concentrated in places where food and shelter are abundant. A park can support a surprisingly large population because humans unintentionally provide food, trees, garbage, gardens, and nesting locations. But remove those resources and the population can fall quickly. Wild populations are constantly balancing reproduction, food availability, predators, disease, weather, and habitat. So an animal appearing common doesn't mean it can support industrial harvesting. Then there's culture. This might be the biggest obstacle of all. Humans don't choose food based purely on biology. We choose it based on history and familiarity. Chicken became normal because generations of people raised chickens. Cows became normal because societies built entire agricultural systems around them. Pigs became normal for the same reason. Squirrels developed a completely different relationship with humans. They're animals we watch. We photograph them. Children feed them. They're part of the landscape of parks and forests. To many people, the idea of eating one feels strange because their cultural category isn't livestock. It's wildlife. And once a society decides an animal belongs in the wildlife category, changing that perception is incredibly difficult. There is also a safety consideration. Wild game can carry parasites and diseases, so proper handling and thorough cooking are important. That doesn't make squirrel uniquely dangerous. It simply adds another layer of complexity compared with buying inspected meat from a regulated food supply. So here's the real paradox. Squirrels are abundant. They're adaptable. They reproduce relatively quickly. Humans have eaten them before. And they're living right outside our doors. Yet almost none of that makes them good livestock. They're too small, they provide too little meat, they're difficult to harvest efficiently, their diets and health histories are uncontrolled, their populations are managed as wildlife, and most importantly, we already have animals that can produce much more meat for much less effort. That's why the next time you see a squirrel racing across a park, don't think of it as a mistake walking through the trees. Think of it as an example of a much bigger rule in human civilization. Being abundant doesn't automatically make an animal useful as food. Nature can produce millions of creatures without making them economically practical to farm. And squirrels may be one of the clearest examples. They're everywhere. They're edible. But turning them into the next chicken simply isn't worth the trouble. Because sometimes the biggest reason we don't eat an animal isn't that we can't. It's that there's no reason to.